So as folks get mic'd up, I think I'll start and build on Bob's excellent framing comments. And I just want to thank Bob, for his leadership and vision in creating the Hamilton Project and housing it here at Brookings. And I also want to thank Michael Greenstone and Karen Anderson for what has been a very productive collaboration leading up to this forum today. So I want to build on Bob's comments. And clearly what we're trying to do here today is have a very clear conversation and discussion about the state role in shaping economies, both to put people back to work in the near term, raise revenues for critical services and investments, but also to generate prosperity for the long haul. So let me make three overarching comments, and then we'll get into what I hope is a spirited back and forth with the panelists. First, the governors and the states are really under tremendous pressure, not just to balance budgets, and not just to restart their economies, but frankly to transform their economies. There really is no going back after this recession to the economy that preceded the recession, one that was characterized by debt and hyperconsumption. I think everyone, the mainstream economists and business leaders in particular, have said we need to move forward to a different kind of American economy, one that is powered by exports and low carbon and innovation and hopefully rich with opportunity. Clearly when we think about global demand, rising nations, the energy imperative made so much more forceful by what's happening in the Middle East, the traditional role of innovation, we have to conceive of and then execute a very different kind of economy in the United States. Now, the second point is states are critical in delivering on that vision for several different reasons. The first reason that Bob mentioned is they have such a fundamental role in both financing and then delivering so many of the assets that ultimately create economies, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's energy, whether it's innovation, manufacturing. We all know about the state role in the financing of K through 12, in the financing of higher ed, in the financing of infrastructure. Michael and I have an op-ed today which lays that out. The second role that states play, however, is not normally discussed, and that is as the overseer of their cities and metropolitan areas. Cities and suburbs are just creatures of state law. Yesterday, the Brookings Metro program put out a report which gave the latest information on the role that metro economies play in their states. And what we found is that metropolitan areas generate the majority of GDP in 47 of the 50 states, including such rural states as Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and Arkansas. In 15 states, one metro generates more than the majority of the GDP. Think New York or Boston or Atlanta or Minneapolis or Seattle. In another 16 states, two metros generate the majority of the state economic output. Think Oklahoma City and Tulsa, or Grand Rapids and Detroit, or San Francisco and LA. Metros are the drivers of their state economy, particularly as we think about moving to this different kind of economy. So first point, we need a vision for a different kind of growth. Second point, states and their metros are critical to delivering that growth. Last point, as Justice Brandeis said almost 100 years ago, states are the traditional laboratories of democracy in the United States. They are really on the vanguard of policy innovation. Whatever states are doing today, the federal government will be doing tomorrow to scale it up and bring it national. The discourse in Washington today, as the governors arrive in town, is frankly about the size and cost of government, as it should be. But I think, based on this panel and the next excellent panel, the states are also going to innovate with regard to infrastructure finance, with regard to clean tech, with regard to export promotion, with regard to urban regeneration. And the innovations that happen even in this constrained fiscal environment will frankly affect national discourse and federal debate for the years ahead. So that's the frame for this conversation. It's really to focus on something which hasn't been focused on in the past several months. We're focused on, frankly, in the 37 gubernatorial elections last year, is how to grow jobs and how to transform economies. We have an excellent panel here. And let me just introduce them. quickly and then really move into questions. On my far left is Rob Puentes, who's my colleague at the Metropolitan Policy Program, head of our infrastructure initiative, former Governor Rendell, former Mayor of Philadelphia, Ed Rendell, and the first distinguished senior fellow in public innovation at the Brookings Institution to basically honor and reward years of public service. Luana Simon, head of Michigan State University. I don't think I got this from Wikipedia, but I think but ninth largest university in the country, more than 47,000 students, and really perceived as the premier land grant institution among higher ed in the United States. And then Mike Finney, head of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and now head of what essentially amounts to a jobs cabinet for Governor Rick Snyder, the newly elected governor of Michigan. So I'm going to start with Mike. And you have a special role, not just because of your official duties, but because of your long-standing relationship with Governor Snyder. Governor Snyder was the chair of Ann Arbor Spark, this nationally renowned entrepreneurial-oriented institution in Ann Arbor when you were running it. What is your philosophy and the governor's philosophy to restarting, transforming the Michigan economy? What kind of programs and initiatives and public-private partnerships are you considering as you begin your work?
Right. Yes. So Governor Snyder, during the campaign, and of course since taking office, his approach has been fairly simple. We're going to reinvent Michigan, and we're going to do it in ways that is fiscally sound. So we're trying to find ways of reducing the burden on businesses so that businesses can continue to invest in our state, and find ways of creating, better educational opportunities for our citizenry so we have the talent base that we need to be successful. And we want to make sure that we keep it simple, fair, and efficient. And if we're simple, fair, and efficient across the board with all of our citizenry, with all of our businesses, we have a very, very high probability of being successful. The governor announced his budget a little over a week ago. And so I've had a very interesting week responding to questions. And it really covers the entire waterfront. It's everything from the public schools to senior citizens to targeted industries that are in one way or another affected by what we do or what he's proposed. The central theme of his proposal, however, is a flat tax that would apply to C corporations in the state of Michigan at a level of 6% versus a Michigan business tax that was very complicated, and I won't even try and go into the details of how that worked. The long and short of it is, by going to a flat tax for business, it represents something on the order of 60 to 70% reduction in overall costs for C Corps. Keeping it fair, and that's simple. Keeping it fair, trying to ensure that the tax burden is in fact spread across the entire base that we have in the state, and not trying to pick winners and losers, and awarding exceptionally large tax incentives to select groups, and in other cases, not awarding incentives at all. So keeping it simple. And then making it efficient so that we can get things done very, very quickly. Government, as you know, tends to be a little bit bureaucratic, somewhat loaded with red tape, and a lack of efficiency. So we're trying to do things that are essentially efficient. So in terms of simplicity, the description that I just described of going to a simple business tax. Fair, distributing the cost of providing services in our state across the entire population, both the citizenry and businesses, and then being efficient, doing things at a pace that we haven't up to this point. Again, if his tax plan were to move forward as is, it would represent about a $1.5 billion reduction in overall costs for businesses. So we think that's the way to rebuild our state and to get it on a path toward economic prosperity. And needless to say, Michigan led the state, and you don't hear me say that often, but we led the state into the recession. And that's not a position we want to be in, but we also want to lead it out. And the bold vision that the governor has for our state, I think, is putting us on a path toward leading it out. We will, in fact, solve that structural deficit that our state faces and that many states face as a result of the initiatives that the governor is moving forward.
So let me ask a follow-up question about the budget and its sense of priorities. around different kinds of investments. I think what's quite interesting about Michigan is you actually lead an executive group within the state cabinet that includes not just the Economic Development Corporation, but the Housing Agency, the Department of Transportation, and I gather the skills training piece of workforce development. How, as the budget was constructed, how have you thought about which kinds of investments should be prioritized, given the essential role of education and infrastructure and so forth, in moving towards a different kind of economic growth model?
Yes, so what Bruce described is that our governor set up 6 group executives. Essentially, if you take all of state government, there are now 6 leaders responsible for groups. My group happens to be the economic group. It includes the components that Bruce described. And what the governor did in his first State of the State address, he really talked about the relative importance of this economic group as the tool that we're going to use to drive our state forward. So in terms of priority for budget, the priority is within economic development, workforce development, community development, and transportation. You know, those are the cornerstones of how you build a robust and vibrant economic climate within a state, and that's where the priority is for funding.
That's great. Luana, the role of higher education. So when I think of Michigan, obviously we think about the big 3, and we think about transportation and logistics and the border with Canada, but we also think of the jewels of the realm: Michigan State, University of Michigan, Wayne State, other higher ed institutions, which probably are as good, if not better, than any other state system. Now, Governor Rendell's going to jump in here. How do you perceive the role of MSU in terms of supporting but also leading Michigan towards a different kind of economy?
Well, first of all, I would say that we're a state without a dominant private university. So other states, as they do their configuration of universities, often are anchored by 1 or more major private universities. In Michigan, the anchors are all the 3 public universities that are 3 Carnegie I extensive research institutions. And with Michigan and Michigan State being part of the Big Ten, or all the members are AAU institutions. So there's a different philosophy, I think, in Michigan than you would find in some other states in terms of higher education. The second thing is it's not a system at all. It's a free-for-all. It has benefited from a very entrepreneurial spirit without a state governing policy. So each institution could be as entrepreneurial as it chose within the definitions of how its governing board determined its role in the state, nationally and internationally. 3 of the institutions, Wayne State, Michigan State, University of Michigan, are publicly elected boards through a political process that is determined by political parties nominating boards. The others are appointed by the governor. So it's a very unique approach. We've been benefited, I think, over a very long period of time, and I'll speak about Michigan State, where the partnership among Michigan State and Wayne State have always been there in working together on behalf of the people of the state of Michigan, with Michigan State having its really fundamental land grant philosophy that we are the university of the state and responsible as a knowledge spire for every part of the state. So that sort of basic land grant philosophy is something that's very, very strong at Michigan State and in the state of Michigan, partnering with the University of Michigan and Wayne State and other institutions. The second thing about that philosophy is that many places and institutions think about their local area as the spire of excellence that will drive the state. Michigan State believes we need to do that for Lansing and for the mid-Michigan area because it's an important component of our livelihood and our capacity to attract and retain faculty and students, but we also believe we have an equal responsibility to every other area. So the engagement in Detroit, for example, in Southeast Michigan has been long and very strong beyond simply what Extension does in those communities, but as a university. For example, the work of the Detroit Chamber around logistics is fueled by our logistics faculty, our supply chain faculty, and has been for a very long time. The issues for Michigan State is we have all of the pieces that you would look at any university. We have business connect operations, we have entrepreneurial networks, we have all of those things, and universities need to have all of those things. What we want to do is be a true partner in those conversations by simply listening to the community's problems, not simply having the answer that our faculty might determine by looking at it from afar. So we spend a lot of time, a lot of transaction cost working with people around those problem definition issues, not simply providing an answer to sort of click in the computer. We also are very proud that 80% of our students come from Michigan as undergraduates. 75% of those students are from families of $125,000 or less, and we have about 24% Pell eligible students. So we see ourselves as a talent development component in a world-class education in which we are reaching broadly across socioeconomic class. We also see ourselves very actively engaged in the things that are important to the state drivers, looking at agriculture, food production, looking at K-12 education and the work we need to do collectively in that arena, and water, environment. You can pick any of those major problem sets, and I think Michigan State has been a part of those conversations, both in anticipating tomorrow's problems, but also working and rolling up our sleeves on today's, and seeing that our responsibility is not simply that the elitism of working on tomorrow's with the world-class faculty, but also the responsibility to working on today's.
So let me ask, and it's wonderful that you and Mike are here and are friends. So the governor's budget, to put it mildly, gave you a haircut. And I'm wondering if you could talk frankly about the nature of the reductions that you're facing and the challenges that you're encountering, and how you continue to play what is a very broad-based role in support of a variegated economy given these fiscal times.
Well, there was a brutal reality to the budget that was presented, but not a surprising reality, and let me cast it in that way. If you were following Michigan for a while, you'll know that Michigan was 49th out of 50 states in increases to public higher education prior to this economic upheaval. So there's been sort of death by 1,000 little cuts along the way where we've had to adjust in that way. To also calibrate, if you look at dollars per student to spend, and you think about the Big Ten institutions, Michigan State has the smallest dollars to spend per student of any Big Ten university. Part of that is our mix of in-state, out-of-state students, where we're 20% and the average in the Big Ten is about 35. Part of that is a mixture of costs because we tend not to price programs that are more expensive higher than other programs because we believe that kids from all backgrounds need to have an opportunity to not look at sticker price to choose their major. And so there's a philosophical piece that goes with this. This budget proposed a 15% reduction in addition to that for public higher education, so the total over this last 4 or 5 years will near 25% of our state appropriation. We have grown in students, and all our metrics are continuing to grow. So you would think that as a business proposition, that would not have been a negative number. But if you looked at the structural deficit of Michigan prior to Governor Snyder's appointment, you could predict going into that a 13 to 15% structural deficit for the state. So we decided as an institution, and we're very unique in this regard, and so we hope good behavior is rewarded in some way. As a public institution, the University of Michigan has done similar planning, so I think the two larger institutions have taken the same tack. We decided that we would plan as if we were having a 13% budget reduction, even though the stimulus money was propping up our appropriation for the last 2 years, that there would become a day of reckoning. And time to plan was better than running up to a cliff and declaring ourselves in a crisis and dealing with all the things that one does, that we could genuinely engage our faculty, staff, and students, our stakeholders around the state in ways that would be productive about our future, and also do that in a way that put new initiatives along with budget cutting. And so if you go to the website, there's something called Shaping the Future. Depending on how you look at that, there are budget cutting targets in there for efficiency and effectiveness, and then if you find some other things, you'll see that we're growing and doing new things. So it was a balance of those activities. We had great cooperation from our employee groups. We have 10 unions, so we're highly unionized. Everybody except the tenure system faculty and a portion of academic staff are unionized. We were through all of this process. We had 1 year of 0 salary increases, modest salary increases, a major change in health care that reduced the cost of health care ongoing by 10%, capped our growth rate for the university at 5%, and eliminated post-retirement health care benefits. All that without any workforce disruptions. So that gives you a sense that transparency and getting everybody to work together does have a positive impact, whether you're in a unionized or a non-unionized environment. We will still have bigger challenges because the governor's budget recommendation also included major changes in revenue sharing at the local level, in addition to the reductions for the MSU extension. Since we are, unlike other states, we don't have a system, extension is a university responsibility, not a state or system responsibility. And about 30% of the funding for extension activities, youth development, economic development, you name it, whatever the communities want, come from the communities. And they rely on us for a variety of services and a variety of studies, whether it's land use or water, or you pick it, they are part of that funding. That's going to be changed as a result of this budget as well because of the nature of revenue sharing. So we're going to have to sort of work with the counties, the local cities, in order to recalibrate the role of MSU extension beyond what will be the 15% reduction that we're doing.
Just one last quick thing just to put on the table before moving on to Rob. When we were talking before, I think you rightly described Michigan as having this sort of first-class higher ed system with a very challenged K through 12 system. I'll just say just a few words on that.
Well, if you look at all of the data that are available, we are now trying to do a transition with Dr. Flanagan, who's the head of the state superintendent, to focus from sort of minimum standards to proportion of students who are college ready in our K-12 system. And the numbers, if you look at the pieces of data, you'll see districts that are 3%, 5%, 9%, 10% college ready graduates, in addition to just the challenges of getting students to graduate from schools. So there's been a very ambitious agenda identified. And what that will mean is that schools that thought they were doing really well because they could be over the old bar will now be below the new bar. And that's going to require all of us to work together on the preparation of teachers, on a whole range of other issues, curriculum, in order for our state to have the talent pool that it needs in what will be a declining K-12 population, in part because of demographics that were already in place and in part because of the outmigration as a result of losing so many jobs. So we have to, as an institution, be a part of that solution and not be a part of the sort of the Superman movie where you can blame everybody else. This is going to be a team effort, just like I think our work on the campus has been a team effort, but it's an uphill struggle, and I give the governor and Dr. Flanagan great credit for taking this on in the middle of the first part of this budget cycle to set the standards at a much higher level.
That's excellent. I think before we move to Governor Rendell, because we've talked about tax rates, we've talked about the structural deficit, higher ed, K through 12. Rob is going to bring the infrastructure issue into sharp relief. And for those of you in the audience, Rob has a paper which is released today on state transport and infrastructure reform. And it's part of a broader initiative we have at the Metro program called the Brookings-Rockefeller Foundation Project on State and Metropolitan Innovation. And we're trying to put out a series of papers that identify specific ideas for governors, state legislators, administrators of key institutions to carry out during these turbulent period. Rob's paper is on infrastructure. I thought, Rob, you might talk and just, or start by giving us your sense, particularly from the state perspective, of the role infrastructure, this broad bucket of infrastructure, plays in supporting and helping move economies forward.
Well, thanks, and thank you all for being here. I think that, the issue of infrastructure is certainly hot right now, thanks to folks like Governor Rendell and folks who have tried to push this to the front burner of the national policy discourse. And I think all that has been very helpful and very successful. We kind of get distracted by certain things, phrases like shovel-ready and high-speed rail, which governors are sending money back to Washington. All that stuff really tends to kind of dominate the conversation, not just here in Washington, but I think across the country. But we know that this, and while all that's important, and we need to be talking about it that way, we also need to make sure that infrastructure is put in its proper context. And just like innovation, just like education, we really firmly believe that infrastructure is one of those things that's going to move the country to this next American economy. It matters because high-quality transportation, telecommunications, energy distribution, all this is required to move goods, ideas, workers quickly and efficiently. I think everybody in the room understands this. I think people get intuitively what infrastructure is supposed to be doing. Clearly, states, state legislatures, governors get this. But the problem I think that we're facing, and the thing that we're experiencing in state after state, is that the infrastructure we have today is not keeping pace with the growth and the evolution of the economy. It's still a system that's rooted a couple of decades ago, and it just hasn't been updated like some of these other areas of policy have been updated. So there's a bunch of problems. One, particularly as it relates to the transportation program in many of these states, is that we're running out of money, and that the revenue sources that have historically paid for the transportation infrastructure in state after state is shrinking, and that's really hitting these states very, very hard. Part of the problem is that we're still heavily reliant on the gasoline tax. In state after state, I think 35 or 40 of the states are still mostly reliant on gasoline taxes to fuel their transportation programs. Excuse the pun, I didn't mean that. But still, it's based on these sources of, on these unsustainable sources that we know are just not going to be just as robust as they are in the future as they are today. People are driving much less. When they do drive, they're driving more fuel-efficient vehicles, driving electric vehicles. All these things are throwing off less money in terms of the gas tax. And most states haven't even raised the gas tax in 20 years. So just inflationary pressures have kind of whittled that down as well. So it's no wonder that in fiscal year 2010, half the states reduced their transportation programs. Another dozen were planning to do that this year. And that's actually better than it could have been. We know that a lot of the federal money, we talk about the stimulus, all these things helped states keep afloat for the last last 18 months. They did a bunch of different things, bonding, debt mechanisms, all these kinds of things have been employed, but I think we're kind of tapping all that out now. We've got to think about something else in order to fund the next round of transportation investments for the future. But as we like to say, it's not just that the system is broke and that it has no money, but it's broken. And as a policy apparatus and a decision-making apparatus, it's just not giving us the right kind of projects that we need for the 21st century economy. We know that money isn't really being spent in an economy-enhancing way. It's still spread around very thinly, based really on political priorities in many cases, as opposed to those things that matter to economic growth and economic competitiveness. We don't really emphasize metro areas in many states. Again, spreading it around doesn't recognize these are our economic engines, and they should be prioritized for all those different reasons. The state transport departments do certain things very well. They do emphasize safety, rehabilitation, maintenance of the existing system, but getting them to think outside of these silos to all these things we're talking about here, I think has proven to be very difficult. It's going to be one of our challenges, I think, going forward. They're certainly not attuned right now to all these things around the next American economy, things like exports, innovation, all the things we've been talking about. I think some states are trying to reorient themselves, and we're seeing some innovation that's happening. As Bruce mentioned, I think a lot of this stuff is going to be pushed forward to the federal level, but a lot of states are going to have to start this themselves. California does allocate money down directly to the metro area, understanding that these places really do drive their state economy. They link up environment, housing, transport, land use, all these things that we all know transport's connected to. California is starting to do that on the state level. Virginia is starting this experiment around using benefit cost analyses to choose their transportation priorities. I think we're seeing some hiccups along the way. You can measure the wrong things and be in worse shape than you were when you started, but they're trying, and I think that's going to have some impacts on some other states. Georgia's Economic Development Authority and their Transport Authority are getting together to think through some of these logistics investments that they're trying to make, some of these giant global challenges. If they're widening the Panama Canal, that's going to change freight movement up the eastern seaboard. What impact does that have on transport investments? They're trying to work that out on the state level now. Michigan, their Office of Public-Private Partnerships, trying to make sure this isn't just about transportation. So there's a lot of things, I think, that are happening in terms of thinking forward. Pennsylvania was clearly a leader in terms of trying to make sure that the entropic nature of other state subsidies was kind of corralled and that we were emphasizing existing places, thanks to Governor Rendell. I think some of those things are starting to change. But all this is still really the exception rather than the rule. There's a bunch of good ideas that are out there, but in order for states really to make sure that infrastructure is part and parcel of the next American economy, we still have, I think, a much longer way to go.
Well, let me ask you one follow-up question before going to Governor Rendell. And I remember when Governor Snyder had his inaugural address, he mentioned the DRIC, which is Detroit Regional, it's the bridge connecting Detroit to Canada. I don't know where DRIC comes from, a horrible acronym, right? Go back and change that. But any low-cost, high-impact recommendations for state DOTs in the near term, in addition to some of those innovations you were describing?
Yeah, and this is the challenge. I mean, because the emphasis, as you say, is on cutting. Cut, cut, cut is the conversation. We talk about investment. People say, oh, that means new taxes. All that conversation, we've got to kind of break past that. I think that one thing we have to do is to make sure that infrastructure investments are geared in such a way that it maximizes economic returns, that we're almost guaranteed that there's going to be an economic return for some of these investments. The bridge in Detroit is probably a great example of that. I think that linking up infrastructure investments to other areas of domestic policy, you mentioned the jobs cabinet in Michigan, all these things have to happen. We have to take it out of its box and make sure it's connected to these other things, which is the goal, which is what it's designed to do. Transport is a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. I think we all know that. But we've got to also couple all this with a more fix-it-first type approach. And we're going to hear much more about that with the next panel. There's a great paper that I know we're going to talk about. We have to make sure that we're taking care of the existing system. We've seen that that's one way that we can generate economic returns in the short term, but we've got to make sure that that's part and parcel of how states do their work. And we've got to just do benefit cost analyses for all kinds of infrastructure projects. We have to make sure that these are not just being done by political log rolling type means. It's not being done just to spread money around. We've got to make sure we're getting more bang for the buck. But there's all kinds of other innovative funding and financing options, I think, that are out there. We're seeing some bipartisan support here on the federal level just this week for this idea of helping those who help themselves. There are a lot of metro areas, particularly in the Intermountain West, out in California as well, Los Angeles, that are going out and not waiting for the federal government to raise the gas tax $1 or waiting for their states to come through with a lot of money. They're going directly to the voters. They're putting together a discrete set of infrastructure projects, and voters are approving them. They're being voted for all across the country. And so the federal government is trying to be able to encourage and then recognize that by helping these people and helping them do that in other kind of places. But then we also need to, I think, think through more public-private institutions. We know that there is a lot of private money that's sloshing around out there. There's private capital, there's sovereign wealth funds, there's foreign investors, there's pension funds. All this money is looking for a home here to invest in the U.S., but many states don't have the mechanisms to entertain those proposals. They can't really conceive them, and when there are those opportunities, they have a hard time making those connections between those investors and the projects that are ready to build. There are ways to do that that still do protect the public interest, but also make sure that they still balance out for the private sector. I think public-private partnerships, again, also something we're going to hear about in the next panel, is an untapped source for the future.
So, Governor, this is the Roberta Clemente role, I suppose, the cleanup bat. I'm trying to bring it back to Pennsylvania, and also showing my age and knowledge of baseball. What what I wanted you to try to do was to first look back at your tenure as governor. And I'll frame it this way, because I think your approach to economic growth was really quite distinct. We had a group in here about 2 weeks ago to focus on exports and a federalist approach to exports. And we had individuals from California, from New York, state leaders, Michigan, Colorado, and Pennsylvania. And the Pennsylvania team came in after hearing from some of the other states saying, well, we don't really have an export promotion or export financing infrastructure, and sort of laid out a very clear and distinct and measured approach that had been taken under your governorship. And frankly, we could say that for other areas of policy, like infrastructure, like energy, like skills training. What was your philosophy as governor with regard to the state role in reshaping the economy of Pennsylvania?
Well, I believe, and I know I'm like a dinosaur, but I believe that government should invest money, should make a difference with its investments. Those investments should be smart, they should be targeted, they should go to building your strengths. But a government that doesn't invest in its own growth will wither and die. And we are close to withering and dying as a country. We've let our manufacturing sector get to the brink of extinction. We're not investing in anything that's significant to the future. What the President laid out in the State of the Union, and there were parts of the State of the Union that I was disappointed in, but what he laid out in terms of investing in the future, that should be not only a roadmap for the country, it should be a roadmap for every state. So first and foremost, I decided we had to invest in education. And I believe that the currency that will determine what countries, what regions, what states have the most viable economy is the supply of knowledge workers. I just had the occasion to speak before the Business Council in Florida last week, and before my panel went on, I listened to one of the other panels with business leaders on it, and all they talked about, they were talking about what factors drive your location decisions. Taxes was about fifth. Number one in every instance, and these were some very conservative business leaders, was the availability of knowledge workers at every level, at the PhD level, at the engineer level, at the community college level, at the high school graduate level. They want high school graduates with sufficient skill sets so they can do on-the-job training and they don't have to remediate. So I think that strategy paid off, and Pennsylvania went from the bottom third in performance on the national test to the top 5 states. Our 8th graders finished first in reading in the national test. 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of in Pennsylvania, absolutely unheard of. And we will bear, the problem with that strategy is most governors, and I'm not patting myself on the back here, yes I am actually, most governors worry about the next election. If you're going to govern effectively, and my advice to Governor Snyder is worry about where your state's going to be 20 years down the road, because that's the only way to really make it work. Set in motion stuff and hope that the things you set in motion are good enough that they speak for themselves and the next administration will just take them over. And I think there's evidence that that works. In the Brookings report on exports, Pennsylvania was highlighted as perhaps the most creative export program in the country. And my successor put out a press release saying the Brookings report highlighting Pennsylvania as the top export state in the country, top export policy, proves that his administration is on the right track. They put that out on the 9th day they were in office. I was looking for some mention of my own name in the... didn't happen. But so we invested. In 2003, when I took office, there was a recession, not like the recession we have today, but I inherited a $2.4 billion budget deficit. We had to, obviously bridge the gap. As Secretary Rubin said, we have an obligation to balance our budgets. But I also knew we needed to jumpstart the economy. We put together a $2.3 billion economic stimulus program. Part of that, for example, was $400 million of venture capital, about $250 million of venture guarantees, where we would give guarantees to venture funds, and about 180 to our Ben Franklin partnerships. We're now 3rd in the country in terms of producing VC jobs with VC investments. No accident. came directly because of state money. We've spent a whole boatload of money on infrastructure, and as Rob said, it helped to have the stimulus money. The stimulus worked a whole lot better than it ever gets credit for, but that may be their own fault. But it worked a whole lot better. We're now doing 1,600 bridges at one time in Pennsylvania. Again, unheard of. That's stimulus money and state investment money through our bonding. And it's the reason why in 2010, Pennsylvania was 11th in job growth in the country. The next industrial state was 29th. Because we spent money. We invested money in our own growth. Is there a company in the United States that has grown successful that didn't invest in its own growth? Absolutely none. And that's got to be a lesson for states. And even in this difficult time, you've got to prioritize where you've got to cut, as the President suggested in his State of the Union. But while you're cutting, you cannot short education and you cannot short economic development dollars that make a difference, including workforce development and the like. And that was our driving philosophy. We also tried to, Bruce, look at our strengths. We're an eds and med state. No offense to Michigan, but Pennsylvania has the second highest number of colleges and universities per capita, behind only Massachusetts. We're a big eds and med state, tremendous medical centers, research centers, pharmaceutical centers. So we put together a program called Keystone Innovation Zones, where they weren't brownfields. These were medical schools and universities applying for KIZ status. And inside those zones, young companies, 7 years and under, paid no taxes and got priority into all of the state's venture funds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because faculty entrepreneurs, student entrepreneurs, PhDs, we wanted them to stay right there on their university campus setting area and set up businesses there, not to go to Boston or to Silicon Valley. And it's had success. Again, it's a program that's in its early years, but I think it can be tremendously successful. Rail is a huge plus for Pennsylvania. We have 68 short lines and 4 Class A railroads. We quadruple the money we spend on producing rail spurs and helping our railroads. Why? Because the railroads are pretty good. Intermodal centers create a ton of good warehousing jobs, which used to be sneered at, but warehousing jobs these days are considered to be pretty good mid-level blue-collar jobs, and because it gives our businesses transportation alternatives, competition to trucking. The Crescent Corridor program, a 6-state program with Norfolk Southern, National Gateway, CSX, 5-state program. Pennsylvania led the states in putting money up. I put $45 million into each of those projects, matched by federal Tiger funds. Tiger was a good example of what Rob was talking about. Tiger was really a forerunner to an infrastructure bank. Tiger gave money out, $4 billion, was it right? $4 billion based on a cost-benefit analysis. And the Crescent Corridor was a hugely successful multi-state program. It got the largest Tiger grant possible. So go to your strengths. Take your strengths. Analyze what you can do best, where your strengths are, and then fund them.
Yes, so just a follow-up question, and then we're going to open it up. You were a mayor. You were a governor. One thing that I thought was striking about your tenure as governor was how much you understood the distinct assets and advantages of different parts of your state. What Pittsburgh was good at, what Erie was good at, Scranton, Allentown, York, up to Greater Philly. And there also was a level of cooperation across agencies to undergird these assets, particularly around downtown growth, but also cluster-led strategies. And I thought you might talk a little about that, because I know with Mike coming in really with this remit across these disparate agencies, I'm not sure the federal government really can come to ground in as integrated a way as a state government to sort of buttress up metropolitan assets.
Well, it's interesting to hear Mike speak. In my second year as governor, as the economic stimulus program rolled out, we did an economic development cabinet as well. And, for example, the Secretary of Agriculture sat on the economic development cabinet. Why? Because agriculture, food processing and agriculture is the largest employer in the state of Pennsylvania. You can't have an economic development strategy in a state like Pennsylvania without agriculture being at the table. PennDOT absolutely has to be at the table. I can't tell you how many businesses we were able to get to expand because the CEO Kellogg called and said, I can't get my trucks out, but you need a 219 bypass. I'll expand my factory dramatically if you do a 219 bypass. Now, we have something that I would recommend to Michigan. The governor has, I don't mean this sounds a little bit like the controversy with Governor Walker right now, but the governor has money, transportation dollars that he can apply to economic development projects that don't go through the MPOs. And I use that money. It was only $25 million a year, but I use that money extremely wisely to create jobs, to do something like that. Or a company's looking at a business park and says, well, geez, we do a lot of our shipping by rail. Your nearest short line is 3 miles away. We put in half the money for the spur. And bingo, that company shows up. So everything's got to be coordinated. The departments have to work together. What Governor Snyder is doing is right on track. And I would like to see the federal government do more. I would like to see the federal government do it more wisely. It can work. New Markets Initiative, Bob, has been tremendous. Again, a real success story that no one gives the Clinton administration credit for it. It's been successful in helping housing, economic development, growth in rural areas and poor urban areas. It's been a great program because, again, it took that sort of broad overview.
So what I'm taking from this conversation, and again, I'd like to hear reactions from it, there is a certain get your house in order piece of business that obviously states like Michigan are dealing with, all states are dealing with regard to the balancing of the budget. But then what I think the recurrent theme I'm hearing here are a set of strategic investments in core elements of your economy, either by yourself or, since a lot of the federal money is essentially flowing through the states. It sounds like a broader bucket of infrastructure than normally would be described in this town. Education, K through 12, up through community colleges and higher ed. And some of the innovation systems, though, frankly, a lot of that will drive through the advanced research institutions, through NIH and NSF. The state may have, with some of these special funds, an ability to buttress and complement those kind of...
But if we want to really be a nation of innovation, again, we have to put some money on the table to spur innovation. Research and development tax credit should be permanent. It should be much more significant. States should have we quadrupled our research and development tax credit. It's one of the things that our businesses actually asked us for. I think the federal government should be in the business of having VC funds. I mean, if we're going to urge innovation, well, how many great ideas die of mourning because the company just cannot, the people who are working on the idea cannot make a living anymore. You know, I mean, it's a small amount of money. It's a small amount of money for the potential return. Innovation. Look at what's happened with NIH as the NIH funding has gone up, that grant funding. And most of the NIH funding goes to our universities. And they're doing great things. I mean, the work at the University of Pennsylvania on the human genome, I mean, that all came from NIH funding. I don't understand why the conservatives don't get it. Business says you've got to spend money to make money, right? I mean, we've heard that since we were kids. And it's no different. You should spend it wisely. It should be targeted. It should be thought through. But you've got to invest. I was on told this story. The last time I was down there, I was on a show with Mike Pence. And he said, you know, we're the party of no. We say no to taxes, no to borrowing, no to this, no to that. And I said, well, Congressman, you seem like a reasonable man to me. Actually, he didn't, but but I've been on those shows enough to know that you want to be the reasonable guy. So I said, you seem like a reasonable guy to me. Tell our viewers, if we're not going to invest in our infrastructure, how are we going to guarantee that our roads are safe, our bridges are safe? How are we going to guarantee to our businesses that we can move goods quickly? Tell us. And he thought about it, and Mike Pence is no dummy. He thought about it, and of course, there is no answer. So he said, there you Democrats go again, using the word investment when you really mean spend. That was his answer. Well, that's no answer. We have to invest in our future.
Mike, let me ask.
And I want to offer just a small comment on that. I think a lot of the narrative about this concept of spending money to, to grow a business or an economy is led by the extremes, right? It's folks at both of the extremes, some who want to spend everything on everything and some who don't want to spend anything on anything.
Right.
And at the end of the day, I really think it's that group in the middle that represents the majority whose voice has not been as vocal. I can tell you Governor Snyder represents that voice that really is about sensibility and investing where we need to, certainly understanding that, with all of us, we have a checkbook that represents the available money that we have to spend. And we have to spend within those means. I think the kind of things that Governor Rendell talked about that he did in Pennsylvania is a model that we've all studied. Right? We've looked at what's happened. We understand a lot of the wonderful tools that were developed, but those were done with a balanced budget in mind and the ability to have a structurally sound budget. Now, the economic challenges we've had over the past few years has impacted every state. But we know that if the state of Michigan becomes financially sound as a state, where we do not have and do not face on a daily basis a structural deficit, our ability to put in place the kind of creative programs that the governor just described and that, frankly, Governor Snyder has asked us to develop becomes much more doable. Our ability to invest in education and so on, these really critical factors become much more doable. I think President Simon, in her comments, there was a subtle remark that she made at the beginning that I think is absolutely right on. Our major universities anticipated, based on the numbers, that we did not have a sustainable financial model for the state of Michigan. So they planned around that. And while there is a small gap between what they planned for and what the governor has recommended, imagine if they had not planned and they faced the entire 15% gap, where our outstanding universities would be. So we have to keep that in perspective. And the beauty of it is that our universities continue to find creative ways to be successful, to continue to achieve, even in challenging economic times. So I think the governor is right on. We have to invest in these things, but we have to make sure that our fiscal house is in order so that we can, in fact, have a successful,
Mike, one other thing for the audience that I think you might want to talk about is that your vision of state government, I think, very much is as part of a network of institutions in the state of Michigan. Some of them are higher ed, some of them are business incubators like Automation Alley or Tech Town or Ann Arbor Spark. I mean, my sense is, as the governor comes in, it's not a focus on state government as just a governmental entity with a set of cabinet agencies and a delivery system. It's really almost as a platform for engaging with a broader set of institutions. And I think as you're thinking of reorganizing the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, I thought that institutional view of partnerships is an interesting view because it's how the world works outside of Washington, right? I thought you might just want to say a word about that.
Yes, so one of the things that we decided early on, and it really came as a result of incredible feedback that we received during the transition process, was that the Michigan Economic Development Corporation represented what I'll call Big Brother with respect to all the economic development organizations that existed at the regional level in our state. The reality is that most of the activity and most of the opportunities come from within the regions. I ran a regional economic development organization in Michigan, one in New York State, and in every single case we tended to lead, and the state tended to be should have been a tremendous resource to us. So what we're trying to do as a part of restructuring the Michigan Economic Development Corp is actually go to that kind of a model where we essentially decentralize and we move away from everything being captured in Lansing, the state capital, to a model where our major partners throughout the state really help us lead. And it's an interesting process. So yesterday I was involved in a 3-hour meeting with about 15 of our major regional economic development partners, and we were essentially giving them the opportunity to help us guide everything from the initial strategy and outcome discussions we want to achieve, to budget, to tax incentives and everything else. And it was interesting. The challenge is to get them to tell us what they think. The most interesting words you'll ever hear if you're sitting across the table from someone who is a decision maker is, what do you think? Because when you say something, you've now committed. And so what we're trying to do through this process is to get our regional partners to say what they think, because then they've committed to be a part of the process. And we're committed to doing that. We're actually moving our staff out of Lansing and into the regions to work at the regional partner locations so that we can be much more effective than we are right now. You know, we've done a lot of things over the years that have attempted to change the paradigm about how to do economic development. Now we're really being aggressive about it, and so far the regional players are responding nicely. They're saying what they think, and in fact they're saying more than enough. My email is blowing up, if you will, as my kids like to say. But it's a process that we think will guide us in a way that we haven't been guided before in reinventing our state and engaging our partners. And our universities, by the way, are one of the key components of that. Sometimes that gets lost in the translation. But there's two things in most communities that are for good forever. We all understand, you know, foundations, charitable foundations. They have money, they invest it, they contribute, you know, a small part of their corpus to various causes. Universities are for good forever as well, in my opinion. And so if you really want to fix something, you have to engage those organizations that have figured out how to be good forever. And our universities are key partners in that regard, and I know President Simon knows that we have been very engaged in working with them and the other major universities that we have in that regard.
One of the things that Mike was a part of at Ann Arbor Spark was working with Michigan State, and Wayne State to create the University Research Corridor, a virtual operation that connects us, benchmarks us against areas that have 3 other universities, mostly a private, along with that mix: Boston, Northern California, Southern California, Texas. We even included Pittsburgh, governor, in that benchmarking, to see how we would rank in a number of variables. Those reports are available on the web, but also the economic development groups in each of our areas work together. And we also have a director now who will be a portal to all of us as we work on economic development, individually Jeff Mason. The other thing I would say about, we're really talking about sort of network of networks. Mm-hmm. And I think Michigan State has been successful because we've worked around the state in this land grant philosophy to develop networks and then try to network the networks. And I think that's the philosophy of economic development that Mike is bringing, Governor Snyder is bringing to the state. And if we can be the most successful integrator of those networks of networks, we believe we're going to have additional capacity and opportunity that will not necessarily flow to folks who see those networks as unique entities. And I think the governor should be commended, and Mike, for really engaging in that network of networks conversation. We then, because again, there are lots of places in the state that don't have universities. Everyone has an extension agent and an extension president, so that's part of their role. But also we've worked with the Mott Foundation through a group called Prima Civitas Foundation, or PCF2, to be that spire that exists for communities that don't have a research university in their presence, so that they are not disadvantaged in this mix, so that the state isn't just a set of spires that grow taller and taller where people are left behind, but we can bring all the state forward in a variety of ways.
Let's open it up for questions. I think they're right over here, and then we have a bunch of, I'm going to start on this side and then move over.
Hi, I'm Rick Rybeck with Just Economics, and I wanted to thank all the speakers in Brookings for this presentation. I mean, it's very helpful, very informative. With regard to infrastructure, as you know, one of the things that struck me over time is something I call the perversity of infrastructure, which is that we build infrastructure to facilitate development. But if that infrastructure is really well planned and executed, land values around the highway interchanges or the transit stations go up. A lot of the development we want ends up going into a cheap cornfield because the land is cheaper. And the people move into the cornfield and don't have the infrastructure they need, so they ask us to extend the infrastructure, which we do because we're nice people. And the cycle starts over again. And so the infrastructure we build to facilitate development ends up chasing away, and we never catch up. The resulting urban sprawl really wreaks havoc on our environment and our budgets, because we end up with so much more infrastructure than we need for the number of people and businesses that we're trying to serve. Chris Lineberger, who's also with Brookings, has done, I think, a really good job of trying to talk about some remedies for that. And part of that is coming up with a user fee for what I call the invisible user. That is, the people who own the land around the highway interchange or the transit station or et cetera. Those folks receive an enormous windfall from public expenditures. And Chris Lineberger has been talking about using value capture as a way to recapture that publicly created value for the public so that basically infrastructure can become self-financing. And I'm wondering from the members of the panel whether that's an idea that makes sense and whether, if it does, we could even take a broader approach, which is to transform the property tax into essentially a value capture user fee by reducing the tax on buildings and increasing the tax on land values. And this would not only help make infrastructure self-financing, but would actually create economic incentives that would pull development to high land value locations, which is where the infrastructure exists and where we want the development to occur.
So broadening out of what we even think about as innovative finance. Rob, you want to start with this?
And broadening out when we think about public-private partnerships. I think some of the problem we have when we think about PPPs in the country, and the governor has the scars to show for some of the stuff. I mean, the leasing of the toll roads is one, I think it's the one thing people look at. They look at what Mayor Daley did, what Governor Daniels did in Illinois, up in Indiana. But this is what we need to be talking about in terms of public-private partnerships. It's the things the governor talked about with the freight railroads, which is privately owned. It's the land development deals, as you mentioned. It's technology companies. We were just in Tokyo looking at the connection between the technology that's deployed on the transit systems, and all this is done in a public-private way. So if nothing else, we need to be just thinking much more broadly about those relationships between the public and private sector. And then you're exactly right. Anything should be on the table. We're starting to do this in spot areas. I think the Tyson's Corner Silver Line's going through there. The private developers or the private landowners there understood the enormous value that they would get from that increase. So they're willing to tax themselves to help pay for it. Those kinds of things will happen in spot locations. We need to ramp all that up. I think it all should be on the table.
Well, I think this is a very interesting question and point because, in fact, if you look at economic development and some of what's happened over the years, not only have you created an incredible incentive for the landowners in those areas where this development has happened, in many cases there's actually been incentives allocated by state and local governments to incentivize the landowners and the developers in those areas, which is totally counter to the point that you just made. So there's clearly a public policy issue related to this dialogue that just has been totally misunderstood and probably improperly used historically in terms of how incentives are placed into deals that essentially encourage sprawl.
So,
one of the things we did in that $2.3 billion stimulus program is we put about a little less than $1/3 billion into something we call Pennsylvania in Our Sites. It was to clean up brownfield sites and get them ready for development. And the reason we did that was, one, it was a metro-centered incentive, but two, infrastructure's there. Most brownfield sites became brownfield sites because they were on a rail line or they were near the port. And the infrastructure's already there. Why build it out in a greenfield and take away a greenfield and open space when probably for less money we can remediate the brownfield? And it worked very successfully. The number of sites we cleaned up were just dramatic, and it helped the Pittsburghs and the Scrantons and the Altoonas and places like that come back. Reading was a perfect example. But just you can do that by building back your infrastructure. Infrastructure is more than just transportation. Infrastructure is having shovel-ready land to go, and if you clean up brownfields, you won't have to expand and take greenfields.
a question from Sandy.
Sandy Apgar, Senior Counselor of the Boston Consulting Group. About the narrative, during the Clinton administration, I set up a large public-private partnership to renovate and rebuild military housing. And when I first proposed it to Congress, a Republican majority, there was stiff opposition because of the impact on the budget. The key word I found was multiplier, the public sector equivalent to leverage in the private sector. That is, for every public dollar, there would be in this program $10 of private capital. In fact, the outcome after 12 years is 11 to 1. That word multiplier doesn't seem to have been in the narrative, or at least if it has, it hasn't been as prominent. And I ask all of those you with the same kind of difficult experience, both at the state and federal level, whether crystallizing this concept, not only in the cost-benefit analysis, but more broadly in the policy debate and in the politics, would help to bridge the gap, which I eventually was able to do and achieve bipartisan support.
Oh, there's no question, you're right. The multiplier effect we use to get political acceptance of government investment and stuff. But even more so, when the federal government scores the expense of programs, there's never any scoring for the offset. It drives me absolutely crazy. The offsets are there. If you invest money in a infrastructure, if the federal government invests money in infrastructure, we can show the federal government has its own studies, say $1 billion of infrastructure investment produced 25,000 jobs. If we're producing 25,000 jobs of people who are not working right now, and they're not, and they average $60,000 a year, there's X amount of federal income tax. There's business taxes to the private companies who get, it's an offset. So you may spend $100 billion on infrastructure, and the federal government gets a return of $40 billion, so it's $60 billion it should be scored at, not $100 billion. But we never do. I think the Tax Act, Bob, of 1974 that set up the scoring, it's the most destructive thing towards investment and growth in this country of anything we have. The way we score is nuts. We don't have a capital budget because we'd have to score all the spending in the year that the capital budget would be floated. We're the only political subdivision in the country, the federal government, that doesn't have a capital budget. You couldn't be more right. Make this man Secretary of Treasury, whatever.
First, ma'am, one follow-up. The other obstacle I faced was OMB.
Yeah, of course.
And had to spend 6 months in a very difficult negotiation, thankfully with the support of Treasury, to achieve a waiver. And that waiver survived the Clinton administration, ultimately has become known as the Raines memo, because Frank Raines then redefined scoring for this purpose and this purpose only. That has just recently been renewed because there was a sunset clause, and even this program, successful as it was faced with closure. That principle, the set of principles, finally was accepted by the OMB, quote, analysts who had opposed the principle. And if, through this panel and any others of you who are in office or advisors, could pick up scoring as a structural issue, it is the bureaucratic obstacle, or at least administrative obstacle, in addition to the political one.
Well, believe it or not, there's an American Bar Association committee that's looking at the act and scoring, and their report ought to be in by 2050, probably.
Bruce, if I could, if you would go to the URC report, you'll also see that we've done an economic impact analysis to try to do the leverage of what we bring in from federal dollars as well as from state resources. And I think the numbers are relatively impressive about why investments in education do produce results. But what's missing in the conversation about education, and I'll say our role in economic development, is what's the metric for an assist? And if you think about, I'll use a basketball analogy since Irvin Johnson is an MSU graduate, there was a point at which it was being a scorer. But part of his success was being one of the great assist leaders, along with many others, to make their team better. And if we're going to do the scoring, particularly as it relates to universities and these partnerships, we've got to have a metric for assists, so that our role is encouraged to be part of that partnership and be a part of the equation, not simply to do our own thing, which is recognized more highly in all the rankings and ratings and all the ways in which states tend to evaluate scorecards for universities. And I think as we move forward, we have to have that assist metric. It can't be a soft one. It has to be based on the application of cutting-edge knowledge and real economic measures. But I think we will do a disservice to the role of education in this kind of partnership if we didn't think seriously about those measures.
I had some folks right over here.
Bang. You got some other bang.
Hi, I'm Jian Chen, professor of finance from Johns Hopkins University. So I come from China, and I'd like to make a comparison. 13 years ago, when I come from China, the railroad speed is like 15 miles per hour. And last year, when I go back, it's like 250 miles per hour.
Going up.
And the speed here is about as fast or as slow as 13 years ago, if not slower. So my question is, when I read the news about the Florida governor rejected the federal money on the high-speed railway, I mean, it's unbelievable, but it's very rational because he is looking forward to the next election and he doesn't want to raise the tax. So my question is, probably to Governor Rendell, how can the American leaders make tough decisions to align themselves with the long-term prosperity of the people, not just their next election?
Well, again, I think you've got to make your case to the public. It's this with Governor Walker and collective bargaining. The way they're talking, collective bargaining, the government always loses? No. Government can win back concessions, and there are tons of collective bargaining stories where the government won back significant concessions. And the same things here, you've got to make your case to the people. And we have to be smart in spending money. So, no offense to the Obama administration, which deserves tremendous credit for actually trying to do something about high-speed rail, but we should take one project and make it work. Demonstrate to the country that it can work. And there's no question, and I know I'm from Pennsylvania, but there's no question what that project ought to be. It ought to be Boston to New York, New York to Washington. Can you imagine if we got 220 miles, which, by the way, China is now testing it, you may know, at 350. But if we went to 220 and New York to Washington was reduced to 1 hour and 20 minutes, in addition to being a boom for high-speed rail, a boom for American manufacturing, producing all those steel ties and whatever, or maglevs, a boom to all of that, to putting construction workers back to work, it also helps the airline industry. Because all of a sudden, we shouldn't be flying, as they do in Europe, less than 500 miles. And yet the shuttle, Boston to New York, New York to Washington, the shuttle, just New York to Washington, screws up Newark, Philadelphia, BWI, and probably to some degree LaGuardia, because the north-south traffic kills, it's what causes planes to sit on the tarmac. We shouldn't be flying planes at that distance. And so let's take one, let's prove it can work. There's estimates that even Amtrak has its own estimate that a a Boston to Washington line, if we spent the capital dollars, would make $90 million a year profit. And I'll tell you how we build it. We're never going to be able to afford it under current conditions. Public-private partnerships. No offense to Amtrak, which I think does a good job. Forget about Amtrak. Let's take that line. Let's put some federal dollars in, every state along the line, put some state dollars in, but let a private company put the majority of the dollars in, and bingo, we could get that high-speed line. And once we prove it can work in one place, then we can take our case to the American people. We shouldn't be scattering all over. Politically, that's a tough sell. That's a tough sell. But I think Rob said in his comment, we've got to start getting away from politics in the way we make investment decisions and start making them based on real analysis. And, I mean, what do you think of?
I mean, in this case, it's exactly right. I mean, I think the way the governors have kind of framed this, as if the federal government is shoving money down into these states that they don't want it, is really disingenuous. I mean, all these projects the states had conceived and applied for in a competitive process that was based on some kind of measures of merit. We can debate whether those were the right measures or not, but the fact that they're being turned back now is because we had this changeover with the governors. So the fact that the money now that was going to Florida, that was going to Ohio, that was going to Wisconsin is now going to these coastal projects in the Northeast, I believe, and in California, we think those are the right projects. And then actually, so the happy byproduct of all this might be that we're getting to what the governor was
talking about. The money, understand, we're playing a game here, because the only way you're going to have true high-speed rail is to have a dedicated rail line, dedicated corridor, right? That costs not $1 billion or $4 billion. It costs, I think, 85 to $90 billion. It's the only, we're not going to be able to get, in the near future, federal government money or state government money to do that. We can get money to contribute along the line, But the only way we're going to do it is through a public-private partnership. The states on the line put in some money, federal government put in some money, a company comes in and does it, and maybe if it's too risky for any private company to come in, we give them small federal availability payments. But we've got to get it done. I mean, it's embarrassing. You know, again, I'm a great supporter of the president. Probably doesn't sound that, but I am. And I called our high-speed rail program, the money we gave out, mid-speed rail, because we were going from 80 to 120. Do you think anywhere in the world they would consider 120 miles an hour high speed?
So we may have to come up with a new embarrassment metric. At what point are you so embarrassed as a nation that you actually begin to do something? You know, I picked up last week's travel section of the New York Times, flipped to one of the pages, and it had an article about Japan's Central Railway building a new high-speed line with more funding for one line than our entire national system. Small country, obviously very rail connected. Private company. Private company. I am being told, what, Ellen? I can't even read this. Okay. One more question. There's one in the back. Thanks.
My name is Contessa Bourbon from the New York Times. My question is for Governor Rendell and Mr. Robert Fuentes. As tension is rising in many states, including Wisconsin, to cut back on benefits of state employees, how can states finance or allocate more funds for infrastructures and education amid a tight budget without increasing the gasoline tax?
I heard education. What was the other?
Infrastructure.
Capital budget. Infrastructure. That's the beauty of the capital budget. When I became mayor of Philadelphia, we had the worst deficit in the history of any American city in terms of percentage of revenue. We had no money to spend. I had to cut everything. It was brutal. I was picketed everywhere I went. But I took a capital budget, which was meek and timid, at spending $25 million a year, and I got it up to $140 million. And we put people to work on our infrastructure, and it was one of the ways we came back. The reason Pennsylvania is doing 1,600 bridges is I convinced the legislature, even in the teeth of the recession, to do $400 million of capital borrowing above and beyond what we normally do for an accelerated bridge program. The good news about capital budgets is if you're capital budgeting $1 billion, your debt service for the next year is $90 million. Now, that's not to say that $90 million is easy to find, but that's a small return on an investment of $1 billion that puts a lot of people to work and cures your infrastructure. Education is harder. You can't use capital dollars, obviously, for operating programs.
And in the short term, we've seen governors have some success with these audits of their state transportation departments in Virginia, in Texas, in Idaho. They've been able to find some of that money by squeezing out some of the waste. There are certainly some things that are going to have to be cut in the short term. I think we can find some of those things if we look hard enough, but then putting together a strategy, again, for investment so that we can sell those kinds of benefits to the American people. I think some of the reasons that we have the pushback, as the governor was mentioning, is because people don't believe that their investments that their taxpayer dollars can be spent wisely. We have to be able to ensure them that these are going to be long-term economic returns and not just short-term political log roll.
And the beauty of doing it now is, one, interest rates on government borrowing, at least for the time being, are very low. And construction costs, which used to be rising like healthcare costs, are now very, very low. We originally we got $1 billion for road and bridge transportation from stimulus. We said we'd do 140 projects. When the bids came back, we were able to do 30 more projects.
So we're going to take a short break. I think what we've tried to do with this panel is to put economy building, economy shaping back into the narrative, along with put government on a diet, focus only on the cost and size of government. Thank you to the panelists.